Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm so excited to be here. I've been a member of the CTO Craft community since late 2020, and I just want to say I love you all and really excited to be here. So today we're going to talk about debugging people problems. I'm Frankie Nicoletti, VP of Engine Solo Funds. We are an LA-based fintech startup building the future of community finance. So let's get started. I regret to inform you that everything is a people problem. I strongly believe that tech is a team sport, building software is a team sport, and that at the root of all things that make all of these challenges difficult is the ways in which people work together. I mean, if you think about it, your architecture decisions consider what frameworks and languages the team already knows. Org design decisions account for who doesn't get along with who. Some of the messiest challenges you'll face are around communication, which is definitely a people problem. And leadership problems are pretty much categorically people problems, and that's what we're going to focus on today. So when you have a people problem, you only ever have three choices. You can try to fix it, you can write it out, you can leave. And this talk is going to focus on number one. You don't need my help for number two. And I'm going to mention number three towards the end. And I don't mention number three to be a downer or to say, oh, when things get tough, you should just leave. I mentioned number three because I think that the place where you can operate from the most optimism, the most hope, and in fact, the most courageous version of yourself is when you know what your boundaries are. And I think that's really important to this entire discussion. Speaking of where boundaries are, your ability to try to fix this is very dependent on two things. One of them is your authority level, which, assuming if you're at this conference, is quite high, but probably not all powerful, right? There's people that you have to get their buy-in or people you report to still, even at this level. So it's going to be related to both your authority level as well as the level of psychological safety that you're experiencing on your team. Not the one you create for your teams, but the one that you experience yourself as a member of the team that you are on, which is the leadership team. Now, psychological safety is talked about very frequently these days, and the main thing that I've heard about it is that it's the ability to stand up for yourself without fear of retribution. But I actually think that it's a little bit more than that. This is my definition of psychological safety, especially on a leadership team, which is the ability to disagree with or give critical feedback to anyone on that team with reasonable expectation that your concerns will be responded to and acted on, and without risk of damaging your reputation or standing in the group. I really think this reasonable expectation that your concerns will be responded to is a significant part of the psychological safety discussion that we are missing. Because just because you could say anything without it harming you in some way doesn't actually mean that any actions being taken on that. And your ability to affect change inside the organization is going to be significantly dependent on whether people are responding to and acting appropriately in response to your concerns. And that's going to affect what you can and can't do going forward. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to share three stories from three startups of things that I've experienced and some of the tools that I used to work through those people problems and either determine what was wrong or figure out how to fix it. And I will share all of these tools in individual slides. You'll get the slides afterwards. But my hope is that you will take away from some of these tools a couple of new things in your pocket that you can use the next time that you are experiencing people problems. Also, I'm sure that some of these stories are going to sound familiar. So let's start with startup A. Call this one Fiefdoms. So I joined this later stage, larger startup, right? Engineering team is over 50. And when I joined, I was sold this idea that I would run a startup within a startup and bring the technology of this team to the rest of the engineering teams and to the rest of the products. And there were so many opportunities here to grow the product strategically. And it took me longer than it should to realize that every time someone said opportunity, they meant problem. And specifically, as I was socializing the ideas of the ways we could bring this technology to the other engineering teams, they didn't want it. Even though it had the potential to supercharge what they were already doing, even though it was a top line item for the business, the other teams were not interested. And they weren't rude about it. They were saying things like, I don't have time. That's not part of my OKRs. It's cool, but how does that even work? Just every excuse under the sun. And this was really curious to me because when I had took the job, they said, everybody's really excited. We're going to do this. And the people that have been here longer than me said, we've tried to get people excited about this in the past and nothing moves. So why didn't they want it? So I didn't have enough information. So the first thing, and the theme of the tools for Startup A is actually how to gather really good information. This is especially relevant when the organization is larger, or when it's been around for a long time, and there's no way you can gather all of the information you need to figure out the root cause of the problem in one conversation. So the first thing that I did was run a survey with the tech leads. There were about 20 of them. And I was really interested in specifically how long they had been in that role, what were some of their core problems, and no surprise, I think, to people on this call is that prioritization and excessive planning were significant problems, as they typically are at startups of that size. As you grow, the ways that you plan and prioritize for things have to change. And these are pretty standard growing pains. And surveys are a great way to gather certain types of information like that when you're looking for a wide swath. So here's my advice on surveys, which is a tool I've used on numerous occasions. The first is to decide if what you really want is raw feedback or whether you want information about specific people. In this case, I wanted information about specific people, but I will tell you the best way to get the most raw feedback, the most candid feedback, is to let people tell you anonymously. So if you can do your surveys anonymously, I highly recommend it because people will be much more forthright with the things that they want to say. But in some cases, like mine, you need information about individual people, so you have to have them tie their name to it. Step 2 is to write down the core information you're looking for and then sort of augment from there until the survey makes sense. Not too big, but if you find yourself only looking for a couple pieces of information from a couple specific people, you should skip the survey entirely and just talk to those folks. I also advise you to write most of the survey questions as open-ended. You are gathering information, not trying to prove a hypothesis. I didn't really have a hypothesis at this point, except to know that it's very common at that stage for startups to have prioritization issues. And maybe their planning process needed an update, but that's not enough information for me to start making recommendations. So I'm trying to gather information here, open-ended questions, and when you do choose multiple choice, make sure to add that other option in there. And the last thing I'll say on this is to remember that more info for you is better than less, except with one caveat, which is not to overburden your team. Like a good security policy or good password policy, it's only as good as the number of people that are willing to do it. And if your survey is too arduous and nobody fills it out, you won't get any information. So try to make this something they can do in less than 10, maybe even less than 5 minutes. So at the end of my survey, what I realized is that everybody was pretty much uniformly struggling with prioritization and feeling like they were spending way too much time in planning meetings. So then I did a step 2, gathering information, which was to run a dreams and gripes session with the engineering manager group. This was a slightly smaller group of people. And dreams and gripes session, which I'll explain more in the next slide, is an IDEO style design thinking workshop. So it's a little bit more in depth. There was fewer people, so it was easier to run something that was more interactive. And what happened when we got through this dreams and gripes session is we discovered all of this historical context for why the teams were built the way they were, what the reasoning was behind that, and how important that was to the organization as a whole, at least from, what their beliefs about what their special sauce was. And that there was this distinct pushback against anything that resembled a platform team, which is essentially what my team needed to become in order to deliver this technology to the rest of the organization. So it gave me a lot of really interesting information, but this is how we got there. So a dreams and gripes session is really similar to a retrospective in that you're going to start with a bunch of real or virtual post-it notes. But the way this works with every design thinking, or most design thinking workshops, work in this convergent divergent, right? You're going to go wide, you're going to go narrow, you're going to go wide, you're going to go narrow. And this is no different. So you go wide with gathering all of this information, you go narrow by categorizing them, and then you go wide by sending them into small groups. Each group is going to have 1 to 2 of these top themes, and they're going to write a how might we statement to identify a solution for that dream or gripe theme. You bring everybody back together. I like to add an asynchronous portion where I allow people to add ideas to how might we statements that they didn't work on themselves. And then this is the part where you enforce some psychological safety, which is that you didn't just ask these people to spend multiple hours on this, to not do anything with this information. You need to select 1 to 3 ideas to act on immediately so that people understand that. I came to the conclusion that there was no incentivization for teams to collaborate together. I didn't get everything I want because what I really wanted was for them to rethink the small autonomous team concept and to think about which teams might be better served as platform teams, which was wholesale shut down because they thought their small teams were part of their special sauce, which I guess is their prerogative. But what I did get past was that OKRs could be shared. So in the end, some teams were able to collaborate together in order to achieve a common goal, and they were incentivized to do that because it was part of their OKRs. So you win some, you lose some. So let's move on to Startup B. I call Startup B the wrong stage startup. So this is what happened at Startup B. I joined Startup B. They had not had a true engineering leader prior to me getting there, which I'm sure there are people listening to this that are groaning audibly because this is a situation you've been in before. It's really messy. And there was a product manager who was doing her absolute best to try to herd the cats that were the engineers and to try to get things prioritized properly. And so when I get in there, there seems to be a lot of what appears to be organization, but none of it's working. So there's a process for how bugs are supposed to be resolved. There are definitely people getting called in the middle of the night on the weekends, but sometimes they're not picking up. The engineers don't seem to have a ton of urgency. Product is frustrated that they can't deliver a great experience to their customers. Customer support is a little frustrated that they have no idea when these things are going to be resolved. And everybody is just sort of disgruntled and unhappy. And so it was pretty apparent to me that what we were looking at was some on-call procedures that were a little too aggressive for the size of team that we had. But then I started to notice other patterns and realized quickly that the product manager must have come from a large company and hadn't had to work in an environment where she had to make trade-offs like this in the past. So instead of my tools in this section being about how to diagnose what's wrong, because I think this is a pretty common thing for us to identify, especially if you have a background in working in early stage startups. You have to be scrappy and you have to make trade-offs. But if you come from a more organized company into that environment, there's a bunch of things that you're going to want that you're not going to be able to have. And people that are experiencing that big company to small company situation have some pretty predictable frustrations. So the tools in this section are more about what I did about that, and rather than diagnosing the problem itself. It's really important to me, especially when working with a peer, that the way that I interact with them is super respectful, right? We are on the same team, right? We lead different teams, but we are part of the same team. And also their success is also my success, especially when it comes to your product manager. So there's two things that I really like to do in situations like this, and I applied both in this scenario, that help me sort of get on the same page with them. And the first one is informal coaching. And everybody's probably familiar with informal coaching, where it comes to the people that report to you or people that are below you in the organization. But I want you to take all those same great skills and think about how you might apply them to a peer. And you really want to be asking a ton of open-ended questions. But the main thing that I think is different here, because a lot of times when you're coaching someone that reports to you, is it's easy to say, well, what kind of a mess is this making in my organization? But when you're thinking about a peer, I really want you to focus on what's happening for them. How is this complicating their professional life right now, as opposed to how does this affect you? Because if it didn't affect you, you wouldn't even be thinking about it in the first place. But focus on how is this affecting them. And so for people like product in this scenario, what's happening is they feel like they can't deliver a great customer experience. So what I needed to do was provide a solution that allowed them to feel like they could provide a baseline level of experience that they would be comfortable with while being okay with trading off some of the other things. If you can't reach a conclusion through some sort of informal nudging and explaining how things should work, then I have a slightly more formal process, which I did ultimately end up using in this case, which is my style of negotiation. So we often think of negotiation as a hardball, like salary, like asked for way more than you need because they're going to try to knock you down, and there's this getting one over on each other. But the thing is, when you both exist on the same leadership team, there should be no getting over on each other. You shouldn't be trying to win some little arbitrary war. At the end of the day, you are both trying to build a business, a sustainable, productive business where all of your employees can have a healthy work-life balance. So you're fundamentally on the same team. So we want to approach a negotiation from this regard, but we also have to have boundaries, right? Because in this case, with fewer than 8 engineers on the team while we were doing this, that's not even enough to run a proper on-call schedule, right? And the thing is that if everybody is having emergencies all the time, then nothing is an emergency, actually. So what I needed to do was say, the bottom line is this, and then here's all this room for the product manager to make decisions about how they would like to run this process. And my bottom line was that not every bug is going to get solved. And that I think P0, these are problems where the customer can't even do business with us. And P1, which are problems where the customer is having trouble doing business with us, but there's maybe a manual workaround, or it's not the worst experience ever, like something can be fixed. Those are the only 2 types of bugs that we're going to solve right now. We're not going to solve the rest of them because otherwise we'll never get any features out. The team is too small. So that was my BATNA, right? At the bottom line is that's what we're going to do regardless of whatever the PM and I agree to. Then you can kind of work through these steps where I explain, the reason we do this is that we are building all these features. We're in the middle of a refactor of this thing. Some of these bugs might not even exist in a couple months. So it's not even worth holding on to them if it's just something that's a little annoyance. But let's absolutely fix the big ones. So we didn't have to go through all the stages to the end where I said, otherwise engineering is just going to do this regardless. We didn't need to make it that far, although I think you need to know where that line is just in case you need to use it. We were able to reach a conclusion where we promised product that we would, in a timely manner, solve P0 and P1 bugs. P0 bugs are things I would wake people up for in the middle of the night. P1 bugs, however, waited until the next business day. And anything that was below that, we're not even sweating because we have a lot of things to do and not a lot of time. And we were able to come to a good conclusion there. Now, I went through this process with the growth team at the same team and did not get everything I needed and ended up having to hit my BATNA for that, which is capping one engineer's time of being able to help them with things that they probably should have been able to do themselves. So you win some, you lose some on this. But at the end of this, the product manager and I were able to maintain a good relationship and also move forward with a shared understanding of how long these types of things would take. All right, we got one more startup story for you, and this one's a little more depressing than the rest, but I think it's one that needs to be talked about in this context. So Startup C is all about what happens when there's no amount of fixing to be done, either because people have done so much harm that it doesn't matter what their intent was, or when you are able to determine that they're just not operating from a healthy place. I was at a startup where, in the process of opening a new location, a security camera had been installed, and a member of the leadership team was caught on the security camera talking to a junior member of someone else's team about leadership team members. There were 3 people she mentioned in particular. One of them was me. One of them was who had installed the security camera and watched this conversation happen live, where she said terrible things about all of us. There was name calling. There was casual comments about how we all deserve to be fired. It was really middle school stuff, really appalling. And I feel really bad for the person that had to watch that live because in real time he's watching it happen. I was given the opportunity to watch the tape and I declined because I didn't think I needed to know exactly what had been said. It didn't really matter to me because the fact that that conversation happened at all was problematic. But that conversation was not the worst part of this story. The worst part of this story is that it took the founder 4 days to fire this person. Not only did the founder go around and ask everyone else what we thought they should do, and this was a decision that they should have made entirely themselves and not put on us, but they had a bunch of things to say about wanting to forgive first. And the problem is that because that happened and it caused us all so much pain and made it seem like this was a little bit acceptable for a couple days, it left the door open for some other significant bullying to happen in the organization later, which is one of the primary reasons that I left. So if you take nothing else away from this talk, although I hope you take many things away, is this quote by Jocko Willink, which says, "It's not what you preach, it's what you tolerate." Now, sometimes the bad apple works for you, and you can just handle it. I have fired engineers within 30 days of being in a new company for insubordination and misogyny, like combined. And I have worked for CEOs that lied to me to my face, and we would make an agreement on the phone together, and then when we got into the group meeting, they would say, "I can't believe you would say that. That's not what we talked about." So these bad apple stories could take a bunch of different stories and a bunch of different paths, right? And sometimes you could do something about them. Sometimes you don't have the authority to do something about them. But when you have the authority to do something about them, you need to take decisive action, because you need to demonstrate that this is not something you will tolerate. Otherwise, you are basically saying that you allow it. And there isn't really a lot of gray area in terms of what people take away from your actions here. Where there is gray area is what happens when you're not sure that this was a bad apple situation. And so the tools that I want to talk about in this section are more related to helping you determine whether that's true. And then once you know it's true, then you have to act. You have to do something about it. So in this case of Startup C, this was out of my control. This was someone who was at my level, and the only person that was really going to be able to handle this situation was the founder, who, as I mentioned, did not do a great job. But there have been times where a member of leadership team has come to me and said that, like, say, someone on my team is not communicating well. I think specifically, they thought the other person had an attitude. And whenever someone talks about, well, this person has an attitude, I have a lot of questions, because that could mean a lot of different things. But one of the tools that I used in this case was mediation, because I wanted to determine if they were just having communications problems, or if one of them actually was sort of stepping outside of the lines. And so mediation is a tool that I really like. Mediation would not have been appropriate for the situation with the security camera, because there was hard evidence that something terrible happened. But as you are navigating, is this a 5-alarm fire situation? Mediation can be a great tool. So the first step when you think you need to do this is to determine who should mediate. And it might not be you. In fact, it's probably not you, depending on who it is in the organization. This really needs to be someone who doesn't have a vested interest in the outcome, who isn't going to side with either one of those people, and probably who has a high degree of emotional maturity and or maybe experience doing this in the past. HR is often a great choice. There should not be other spectators in the room, because again, we're trying to create a space where there's enough psychological safety for someone to get to the bottom of this, and this is not a session you record. Once you have that, then the mediator is going to start by setting up the rules. In this particular case, where I did this between a member of leadership and one of my team members, I said, I want you both to agree that you are going to let each other finish. You're going to let each other finish speaking, and then you can talk. If we had been in an actual office and not over Zoom, we might have had a talking stick. But I felt like part of their problem was cutting each other off in these conversations. And I also made it very clear that I was guiding the meeting. So once you start the meeting, you follow the meeting guidelines. This is one of those cases where if either of the people or both continue to violate the rules, you should terminate the meeting immediately. You will need to take different kinds of action. But in this case, what actually surfaced from this mediation is that because they were both talking at 90 miles an hour and not allowing each other to finish, they didn't realize that they were actually saying the same thing. And what that meeting did was create an environment where the member of leadership could trust my team member with more things, now that they understood how they thought and how they worked through problems. That's not always the case, right? Sometimes you will get to the end of that and realize that some other things are wrong and you will need to take other decisive action. But again, we want to really approach these people problems from a place of hope. Like I am optimistic that something else is going on here that can be fixed, whether it's process or communication or something, so that these problems can be resolved. And that's what we want to focus on first. So this is a great first line of defense when you think that something bad might be happening, because maybe it's not as bad as you thought, or maybe it's something that has an easier fix that was immediately apparent between people having massive communication issues. Sometimes this isn't enough, and you need to move into something that's a little bit more serious. And this is, I label this formal feedback, but it's not really formal feedback if you are not their manager. I will also caution you that before you go into any sort of situation where you try to give a peer formal feedback like this, that you talk through it thoroughly with your CEO and with HR if you have one. If HR or your CEO do not agree with you, your options here are really, really limited. And if they do agree with you, this might even be something that you could just hand off to your CEO to do. But if you find yourself in a weird situation where people generally agree with you, but for some reason can't or won't deliver this message, and you are really invested in fixing it, there are ways to deliver formal-ish feedback to your peer. And the primary thing that you're going to do is bring a witness with you, right? Add someone else into the room. It could be HR. It could be your CEO if they were willing to do that. And then you're going to write a summary of it afterwards. Because even if the people who do hold the authority to truly do something about this are not ready to take direct action at this moment, at least it's been recorded. And you will know that you have done everything you can. I hope it never comes to this for you, because the next step after this is the very last thing we're going to talk about in this talk, which is what happens when you just need to leave. But hopefully, even maybe a conversation with HR or your CEO is able to help you out or clear some of this up for you. And like I said, this is a last resort, and I hope you never end up in this situation. So the very last thing that I will say on this topic is, what is this last resort? When is it time to leave? And remember, we want to know what our boundaries are, because when you know what your boundaries are, you can be the most courageous, optimistic version of yourself and bring all of your creative problem solving and debugging skills to any people problem, no matter how sticky or complicated it is. But what you can't do is punch a brick wall repeatedly, because that's not good for your mental health. Further, it's not great for your direct reports or even people on the leadership team to watch you go through that. If you aren't making progress, you need to start thinking about what your options are. I'm not saying you have to leave immediately with no notice, but at least know what your boundaries are and be respectful of them. You are not a hero for enduring abuse. After I left the startup with the security camera incident and I was job searching for my next role, multiple recruiters and hiring managers that I spoke to said, "Are you okay?" And I think for some people, it might be reason not to hire me right after that, because I had been through some stuff that was absolutely unbelievable, because the security camera incident was only a small part of what was happening at that company. But you are not a hero for enduring abuse. You are not doing your direct reports any favors by allowing them to see you continue to hit a brick wall. You are not helping your peers who admire you to see you doing that. So you need to have some boundaries also, and understand that not everything is fixable. The things that are fixable and that are within your power, absolutely go to the ends of the earth to make that situation better for everybody. But don't endure abuse. It's really important. And the reason we don't endure abuse is because people who admire you will mirror your behavior. This is as much a warning as it is an opportunity, that what you do influences and impacts other people. So the way that you courageously and compassionately handle people problems, the way that you make a decision to stay or go, all of these things are noticed. And people who admire you and want to be like you will say, all right, well, that's what I need to be doing in this situation. So this is why we don't stick it out in environments where we were being actively mistreated. But also, you should make a really good effort to try to resolve people issues before they become overgrown and unfixable, before somebody has a chance to do so much harm that it doesn't matter what their intent was. This is arguably the most important thing we will all do as leaders, as manage our people problems in the healthiest way possible, not just for our own selves, but for everyone else who's watching. And that's all I have for you. Thank you so much.